Okay, we have been, for the last few weeks, been looking at the topic of voting, and this all started, for those who weren't here, although I think a lot of us were, so anyway, forgive the recap. If anyone's online, maybe it would be useful. This started as a result of a WCF video that came out last month, and it encouraged me to bring up this special Bible study, if you want to call it that, looking at the appropriateness of followers of Jesus to participate in political elections. So just to recap, we played a clip with one sister and then another from another sister. They were making the argument that voting is one way to help those who are less fortunate than us. I tried to at least play the devil's advocate and say, yes, it's theoretically possible to benefit other people through the voting process, voting for a politician, for instance. If you wanted to see less guns floating around in the streets and a particular candidate was voting or running on a platform of gun control, then you could very well see a reduction in guns if you voted that politician into office. The flip side, the downside is there's something that's being, at least one thing that's being overlooked in that particular reasoning, and that was politicians typically don't run on just one policy item. Usually they have a platform, an agenda, they have multiple things that they run on. And that's one of the problems that we end up with, is that some of these parties or politicians have other policies they would like to see enacted that they would move forward with if they were elected. And we cannot just ignore that side of the debate or the alternative reason for abstaining from the political process. We went through a little exercise. I have up here, I think this was like the last video clip I had shared, and this was kind of a summation of where she stood after what I just shared with you was presented to her. Brother Jacob Larson had brought up this dilemma, and her response was, well, it's all an exercise in trying to do the best you can. I think, like you're trying, sort of like with any decision you make, we're trying to make the best decision that we can with the information that we have at the time, and I think God would agree with. Not fully persuaded with that as being the best attitude to take with regards to this matter. Anyway, to show some of the problems was with this reasoning as far as, well, I'm going to vote for a policy or politician due to certain policies. I ended up sharing 9 policies from the past. I'm not going to go through them each, but they're all, there were some quibbling or nitpicking last week when I brought these up on a few of them, but overall they are desirable, or at least you could admit they do have the benefit or helping benefit others. For instance, this one here, the extensive development of insurance for old age. You would think that that's kind of a good thing. It would fall under the umbrella of caring for those who are less fortunate. The only problem with these was the problem that I shared at the end of going through all 9 was that they all come from the 1920 Nazi Party platform. And in addition to these 9, you can call them beneficial policy items in their platform, of course, they had a large number of rather reprehensible policies that they wanted to put into power. And of course, they did when they came to power. And the Nazi Party came to power through the political process. It wasn't a coup or a violent introduction of Hitler. He was elected into office. Okay, so then I also gave this exercise of, we don't know, often at times when you vote, we don't really know the candidate. And I gave this exercise of candidate A, candidate B, candidate C, And to candidate C, at least you're just looking on the screen, had, I would say, if you didn't know who they were, would have the cleanest resume, if you want to call it that. The problem was that candidate C was actually Adolf Hitler. And it was A, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Hitler. So another example of where we could run into a problem. We really don't know who we're putting into office with some of these individuals. Okay, so moving on to new material here. Let me get caught up here with my notes. So to recap, the sisters who advocated voting as a way to help others, they were running, I guess their position is based upon the idea of loving your neighbor and justifying their position, which, okay, you can't fault somebody for wanting to love their neighbor. That's what Jesus told us to do. But as we've seen in the two exercises from last week, this particular position ignores some hard facts of the political world. Unless you happen to be talking about a referendum vote where you actually just have one particular policy that's up and down, that's not connected to a particular candidate, like reducing taxes, and that's all the vote is on. Unless you happen to have a referendum, you have this dilemma of putting into office somebody who has also policies that could be detrimental or may be a violation of some principle that you find in the Bible. Now, there actually is a term for what we're describing here. When you want to see a new policy enacted so badly that we ignore or we hold our nose and vote for the candidate despite the negative things about them. The term for this is consequentialism. And in plain English, consequentialism is a belief that the end justifies the means. And regardless of what you call it, you run the risk of being labeled as a Christian hypocrite with this particular strategy. And we should, as Christians, always be above reproach and should never give an opportunity for somebody to level a charge of hypocrisy against us or be repulsed from the message that we wish to share with them as a result of our actions. And we definitely don't want the message of the gospel to become a stumbling block to unbelievers because of our political leanings or our affiliations. And I can give you an example. Let's say you've decided to vote for a Democratic candidate for president because they promise to reduce taxes on the poor, expand health care benefits for the needy and elderly. They also plan on banning assault rifles. So you decide to vote for that Democrat president candidate. However, what we're overlooking in this little example is this particular Democratic candidate supports homosexual unions. They have transgender affirming policies they would like to put into place. And they believe in free access to abortions. So what happens if you vote for this Democrat presidential candidate and you go to work and someone says, well, who'd you vote for? And so I voted for the Democratic candidate. Well, that coworker or your friend or neighbor knows that you're a Christian. They can easily point the finger and call you a hypocrite because you voted someone to office who has policies that they would argue are contrary to the Bible. What do you do? What do? You just brush off the criticism and say, well, that's life. That's life. That's just the way it goes. So that's another problem with voting just one particular policy or a few policies and ignoring all the others. This issue of consequentialism and Christian hypocrisy. There's also another thing that we need to consider and look at, and we're going to spend most of this day looking at it. And it's not consequentialism, but The terms both begin with the letter C, and this is complicity and culpability. And this has to be taken into consideration when we do ever think that voting is acceptable. So what is complicity? I think I got a definition here. So complicity can be defined as a condition of being involved with others in an activity that is unlawful or morally wrong. So that's complicity. And I had a bit of a problem trying to distinguish the difference between complicity and culpability, but there actually is. Culpability can be defined as a state of guilt or responsibility for wrongdoing or failure. They could be synonyms, but there is a difference between the two. And what I'm going to do this morning is look from the Bible, give you some examples of complicity and culpability. But before we do that, just to make sure it's clear what we're talking about, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say there's this bad guy named Bugsy, and Bugsy wanted to go out and rob a bank. And in planning his heist, he asked his friend Bruno to drive the getaway car. So Bugsy, he goes and he robs the bank. He rushes out of the bank. He hops into the car. Bruno's waiting. He's ready to drive off. And they speed away. But a few miles down the road, police officers set up a roadblock, and they catch both Bugsy and Bruno, and both of them are arrested. Now, Bugsy is the one who robbed the bank. Bruno was what? He was complicit. How was he complicit? Because he helped. Bruno was complicit in helping Bugsy rob the bank. So that's an example. Bruno would be complicit in the bank robbery. Now, if we go into the Bible, then we go to the book of Judges. I'm going to give you some examples. I've got 4 examples lined up. Hopefully, we can get through them. First example comes from the book of Judges, and we bring into the story here the character of Gideon. And as we go through this, remember this idea of complicity, which is the condition of being involved with others in an activity that is unlawful or morally wrong. All right, so back to Gideon. Who was Gideon? Well, he defeated the Midianites, people who had oppressed the Israelites for many, many years. And he did so with this tiny band of men. And after the victory, the people of Israel wanted to make Gideon a king. Gideon refused. God was supposed to be the king that ruled over the people of Israel. But after Gideon died, one of Gideon's sons got this idea that he wanted to be king. Anyone remember who? Oh, come on. Abimelech. So the son of Gideon, one of the sons of Gideon was Abimelech. There was a problem, however, with Abimelech's plan to become the next king. Gideon, who also went by the name of Jerubbaal, Gideon had a really large family. He had 70 sons, so Abimelech was not the only son. So that creates a bit of a problem if you want to be king, and there's 69 other rivals. In any case, Abimelech wanted to be king. He figured the brothers weren't going to sit around idle and let him do that. So Abimelech, he had a plan. And this plan we find in Judges chapter 9. And we'll read here from the screen. Now, Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, Gideon that is, went to Shechem to see his mother's relatives. He said to them, to his mother's entire extended family, "Tell all the leaders of Shechem," Shechem's the city, "tell the leaders of Shechem this: why would you want to have 70 men, all Jerubbaal's or Gideon's sons, ruling over you when you can have just one ruler? Recall that I am your own flesh and blood." His mother's relatives spoke on his behalf to all the leaders of Shechem and reported his proposal. The leaders were drawn to Abimelech, and they said, "He is our close relative." Continuing on, they paid him 70 silver shekels. This is the people of Shechem paid Abimelech 70 silver shekels out of the temple of Baal Berith. Abimelech then used the silver to hire some lawless, dangerous men as his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah and murdered his half-brothers, the 70 legitimate sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. Only Jotham, Jerubbaal's youngest son, escaped because he hid. All the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo assembled and then went and made Abimelech king near the pillar of Shechem. So Abimelech becomes king with the assistance of the people of the city of Shechem. In what way did the people of Shechem help Abimelech become king? They gave him money, 7 pieces of silver. And what did Abimelech do with the money? They hired some thugs. Very good. That was the word I was going to use. And the thugs rounded up all Gideon's sons and they executed them. They were all murdered with the exception of one man named Jotham who escaped. So if we keep reading, we find Jotham eventually confronting the people of Shechem. And notice what he says to them. When Jotham heard the news, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim. He spoke loudly to the people below. Listen to me, leaders of Shechem, so that God may listen to you. But, and this is what I want to emphasize, but you, who's he speaking to? The leaders of Shechem. But you have attacked my father's family today. You murdered his 70 legitimate sons on one stone and made Abimelech, the son of his female slave, king over the leaders of Shechem, just because he is your close relative. So I want you to notice something. Jotham accuses the leaders of the city of Shechem of attacking and murdering the 70 sons of Gideon. And yet, is that true? David, you just used the term. Who was the ones that Abimelech hired? Thugs. Well, Jotham is not saying the thugs murdered or attacked his family. He said, you, the people of Shechem. Isn't that interesting? Why does he say that? Because of this concept of complicity. The people of Shechem were complicit in the death of these 70 men, even though they, the people of Shechem, did not lay a single finger on Gideon's sons. They were guilty of shedding blood and murder by association. If they had not supported Abimelech, then the 70 men would not have been killed. Okay, this is culpability, complicity. All right, so moving on to example number 2. This comes from 1 Kings chapter 21, where we read about how King Ahab, king of Israel, wanted a vineyard that was owned by an individual named Naboth. Now, does anyone know the story? Raise your hand if you know the story. Okay, so those who have their hand up, I want you to tell me the story briefly of Naboth and Ahab. What was going on and what happened? Someone would just raise their hand. Okay, we got Jason. So the story of Ahab and Naboth.
So Ahab wanted to buy a vineyard from his neighbor Naboth, and Naboth said no because it was his inheritance. And Ahab went home. He was very upset and pouted, and
Right.
His wife came in, and it was Jezebel, and she said to him, you're the king. Why are you pouting about this? Why are you upset? And I'm paraphrasing here, but
That's great.
And so he said, you're right, I forget how that conversation ended, but he gave her some kind of authority. I can't remember how to do
Actually,
what she wanted.
no, he didn't say anything. He just pouted, and
He just pouted.
Jezebel said, "You're king. I'll take care of it."
Okay, so then Jezebel hired some thugs like previously, set Naboth up, and they killed him, and then he was able to take his vineyard. And I feel like we read somewhere else in the Bible, he killed his family members too. In one of the
Yeah, I don't remember that, but you got the point I wanted to get across was that Ahab wanted the vineyard. Jezebel intervened. She then hired thugs who ended up accusing Naboth, who was stoned to death, which meant we got a free vineyard. It's yours now, Ahab. So, in this, recounting the story, well, actually, before I get there, it's going to seem like I went off tangent here. Here we go. This is going off tangent. I'll come right back to Naboth and the vineyard story. Who remembers this game called Clue? Okay, all right. I don't know if it's still as popular, but it goes all the way back to the 1940s. And Clue, for those who don't know, is a murder mystery game for 3 to 6 players and produced by Hasbro. And the object of the game is 3 things. 1, you're supposed to determine who murdered the game's victim. 2, where the crime took place. And 3, which weapon was used. And each of the players involved in this game assumes the role of one of 6 suspects and attempts to deduce the correct answer by strategically moving around a game board representing the rooms of a mansion and collecting clues about the circumstances of the murder from the other players. All right, so that's Clue. What in the world does that have to do with 1 Kings chapter 21 and Ahab and Naboth? Well, because I want to ask you the first question or the first goal in Clue, and that pertains to the death of Naboth. My question is, not who killed the butler, but who killed Naboth? Who killed Naboth in this story? Anyone want to venture an answer? Walter? Huh? The people who stoned Naboth killed Naboth. Okay. Anyone want to disagree? Okay, so you might say Jezebel was, okay. And if we're talking about complicity and culpability, okay. If we turn to 1 Kings 21, so we're going back to the Bible here. Let's read 1 Kings 21, we'll pick up verse 16, and we'll find out something very interesting pertaining to who killed Naboth. As soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab rose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite, to take possession of it. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, "Rise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession." And notice what Elijah says to the king. "And you shall say to him, thus says the Lord," actually I should move better than that. This is actually God speaking via Elijah. "Thus says the Lord, have you killed and also taken possession? And you shall say to him, thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick up your blood." All right, so no one mentioned one other character who could possibly be described as killing Naboth. Walter's in the back raising his hand.
So what I was doing was trying to emphasize part of the point you're making. If we look at it from the literal position, the people who picked up the stones, they actually caused Naboth to die. But when we look at it from God's perspective, he looks for the one who's really culpable, the one who's part of the conspiracy, if you will, to do it. And if you turn back and look, Naboth was the one who coveted it and wanted it, but it was his wife Jezebel who actually ordered and made it happen. He has culpability, and she certainly made sure it happened. So I hope that's along the line you're looking for so far.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully you'll understand, how this will tie back to the topic of voting. I hope you have that in the back of your mind. So,
We have one more.
okay, John.
Just the way that the words of the Lord are phrased, it's have you killed and also taken possession. So he states it as a fact that you've killed him, and now you're going to take possession as well.
Well, you could actually you could take the other argument because there's a question: is it true? You could say, well, maybe God's got it wrong. Ahab will come, look, God, I didn't do anything. Remember? Because there's a question mark up there. Okay, you can make that argument. However, what's interesting, I hope I have a slide. No, I don't. If you look, this is in the RSV, but in some translations it actually is a statement. It's not a question. It's God saying, you killed Naboth? It isn't a question. Maybe some of you can verify if you've got a version, but I know in some of the versions it's actually a statement, not a question. The point in this is, in God's eyes, even though Ahab did not issue an order, he was part of a chain of events which wouldn't have happened if it weren't for him. How does that relate to voting? We'll get back to that. But I want you to keep in mind, you don't have to, drop the bomb, swing the sword, shoot the bullet to be guilty of bloodshed. And Ahab here is being called a murderer. This is an example of complicity and culpability. So moving on to another example, this one story we know quite well, is about King David and David's affair with Bathsheba. And remember, when he learned that Bathsheba was pregnant, David then arranged for her husband, Uriah, to return home to her. The hope was that he would get, well, let's just say they would be intimate, okay? And there would be the idea that, okay, if Bathsheba's pregnant, it must be Uriah and not David and his little affair. Of course, that did not work out. So David had to come up with plan B, and this was part of plan B. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front of the line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die." So this was, maybe it could be plan C or plan D. There was a couple plans David had and they weren't working out, but this is the final plan he came up with. So Uriah was supposed to be killed in battle by David's command. So the question I ask to you is, who killed Uriah? All right, who killed Uriah? We saw that Uriah was intentionally battled or intentionally abandoned on the heat of battle. And who knew about it? David? Joab. Okay. Now we get to the story. What's interesting, it talks about the Ammonites. Whoever it was, I think it was the Ammonites who were the ones that killed, literally, if we want to get to Walter, literally killed Uriah. It wasn't David. David wasn't there at the battlefield. And Uriah, he was probably, telling everyone, come on, let's get away. But who really killed David? Oh, sorry. I just gave one there. Who really killed Uriah? So these were the possibilities. Was it the Ammonites? Was it Joab? Was it David? 2 Samuel, we read this. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from you or from your house because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." Look at what God is, again, this is not me. This is God's own words. And he says to David, you struck down Uriah with the sword. Well, David never struck down Uriah literally with the sword. It was the Ammonites or whoever was in the city. But God is putting the blame on David. This is how complicity works. This is how complicity works. We're going to go on to our fourth example from the Acts chapter 2. And if we turn there, we are in one of the high points of Acts is the day of Pentecost when Peter's preaching to this large crowd. And he says this, "Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. So here's the question. According to Peter, who crucified Jesus? It was kind of a question when we started the class on anti-Semitism. I brought up, who killed Jesus? Peter says what? Men of Israel. The men of Israel killed Jesus. And Peter even goes on, this is a little different version, but if you add verse 36, Peter then says, let all the house of Israel therefore know assuredly that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Now, Peter is talking to, 3,000, large group of people. And he says, you crucified. He didn't say you killed him. He said, you crucified him. Is that a true statement? If we go to the book of John, let's see who crucified Jesus. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold, your king. They, the Jews, cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. All right? So they took Jesus and went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others, one on either side, and Jesus. So who here in this passage crucified Jesus?
I would say Pilate and the Jews.
Pilate and the...
I think Pilate is just as guilty because it was in his power to stop it, and he allowed it. He even washed his hands of it, but ultimately the Jews, as Apostle Paul is saying.
Well, the literal act of crucifixion did the Jews do?
So you have those who gave the affirmative to crucify him. That's the culpable group of people, however many Jews that was. Then you had the group that was around them that didn't do anything and say, well, no, you're wrong, we shouldn't do such a thing. You have Pilate, who actually has the authority and does the crucifixion. But once again, God puts the blame back to those who gave the affirmative.
Is that true? Did Pilate go out with a hammer and nails and...
Oh, I'm sorry. I see where you're trying to go even more subtle. No, it would be whatever centurion or soldiers who actually did the crucifying. They're the ones that actually did it to him.
Okay. It's interesting, last verse, there they crucified him. Well, it's like, who are the they? Well, if we continue reading in John 19, we get this. So they took Jesus, again, the they, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him. Okay, sorry, that is actually, I'm highlighting the very last verse. There they crucified. So we're like, who's the they? Scratch, scratch. And here, continuing on, verse 23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 parts, one for each soldier, also his tunic, and the tunic was without seam, woven to the top of the bottom. So we're getting Jews, Pilate, soldiers.
Chief priest seems to be singled out in the previous passage you had as well, like literally handing him over to them.
So Pilate handed him over to the chief priests. But how is it the chief priests had command over the Roman soldiers? That's an interesting link, because here we have the soldiers, and if you read, I don't remember where, maybe in Mark, It talked about the centurion who, when Jesus expired, said, truly this is the Son of God. And a centurion is only a Roman soldier. So we got Pilate, we got the Jews, we got the chief priests, and we got the Roman soldiers. You could all make the argument that they crucified Jesus. I suspect only one person literally put the nails into Jesus's hands and feet. And yet, despite one person doing the act, you've got this whole entourage, this whole collection of people who are complicit and culpable for the death of Jesus. Okay? So I'm trying to drive home this concept of you don't have to be the one who does the dirty deed to actually be guilty in some sense for the dirty deed.
But it's the most important person that's responsible is the one that set it in motion, started it.
Right.
And other people just fed into it.
So how does this fit into voting?
Who? Oh, Jerry?
Jerry has a comment.
You need to sit closer to the back.
So couldn't this rationale also be applied to what Israel is doing right now to Hamas by killing civilians? And their argument would be they are complicit in the massacre that took place in October, and whether you want to call it guilt by association, or that they are, because they allowed Hamas to be their rulers or voted for them or whatever you want to say, it's okay to kill them because they're associated with them. And so you could make that argument. And by the way, and we don't need to go on this road, but you could also argue this whole idea of guilt by association, right? And so like if one of us, let's say in the meeting hall, were found arrested and tried and whatever and thrown in jail, could the argument not be, well, this ecclesia supported that person, therefore they are also guilty for what this person did?
It's possible. We should have known better and taught them. Getting with the Hamas and Israel-Palestine situation, I mean, you want to continue this, blame game, how the links are connected. You could also say, well, who's supplying Israel with a lot of her weapons to kill Hamas, who ends up killing the Palestinian citizens? So it's like on both sides, whether you take the Hamas side or you take Israel's side, there's going to be complicity down the chain somewhere. And this is where it gets into voting. We may be voting for a perfectly good reason to reduce the number of guns on the streets. But what else are we supporting by putting that candidate into office? And can we just, like Pilate, wash his hands and say, I had no moral responsibility for what happens as a result of putting this man or woman into office? This is what I'm trying to drive home. And this is very, very, very important, this verse here Jesus said in Matthew 10:16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Okay, we are in a world of wolves and snakes and whatever. But Jesus says, be wise as serpents and _ innocent as doves. And this is why we need to be careful, of this matter about getting involved in the political system, whether it be actually running as a political officer or putting somebody into office who then does the various deeds that could perhaps result of that. The one thing we forget easily is that there's no way you can govern a society, a group of people, without what? The threat of violence. If someone doesn't obey your command or law, you threaten them with jail time, punishment of some sort, and in the good old days, violence. You would go out and hang somebody or whip them, or capital punishment. You cannot govern a people, at least unless it happens to be the saints of Christ in the kingdom of God, you cannot govern a people without the threat of violence. There's always that there, and any politician in national office or even at the state level, you're going to find some link to the threat of violence or the use of force or bloodshed somehow connected to that individual. Example, I think I've given this before, 2004, presidential candidates, John Kerry, George W. Bush, were in the middle of the Iraq and Afghan war. They both vowed and said, if you vote for me, I'm going to continue the war in Iraq. Can you, if you voted for one of those two candidates, say, my hands are clean for what happens as a result of putting that candidate in office who says he's going to continue the bloodshed? Okay? That's an example of this complicity, culpability question. Do you think it's a fair question to bring up in the conversation about voting? I think it is. I think it is. Is it Adam?
Just to go back to Gideon, when he's fighting the kings that were terrorizing Israel, on his chase after them, he stops by two cities. Succoth was one, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the other. And he said, "We need bread. We need help." And they said, like, no, like, we're not going to give it to you. We're going to wait this out. We're going to see, we're going to not participate in what's happening. And he says to them, okay, well, I'm going to come back and I'm going to punish you, to both of them, for not doing anything at all. And I'm not trying to make an argument voting. I agree with like the historical perspective the Christadelphians have. But can't you also make the argument that not doing anything at all puts you at blame for the things that the person who's in office does,
So you're saying like we're responsible for failing to act and not stopping, let's say, an injustice, or is that what you're saying? That would be an argument against what I'm arguing.
You have to weigh those things together, right?
So in the case of voting, it would be if we didn't vote for someone who's running against Hitler, we would be responsible if Hitler got into office and we didn't stop Hitler because we didn't vote his opponent into office, something like that. Yeah. I mean, we never know what could happen when we wake up in the morning. As far as if we don't do something, that I think is not a very strong argument. I know what you're saying. It's when you look at Jesus' words to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. I think when we realize that these politicians, we know that they are in power and maintain power through the use of or the threat of force and violence, and how they're connected to war. If we're talking about simply voting these politicians, I'm having a difficult time reconciling what you're saying with this innocent as doves. We just simply don't know what's going to happen, and I think the safer position is to abstain rather than get involved, cross our fingers, and hope we're somehow averting a train wreck if we were somehow to vote. Walter, you had something?
Two last things. I'm a firm believer in Daniel chapter 11. I believe in all the small details and every detail